If you've been with us a while, we've been doing 1 Peter. We've taken a break from our 1 Peter series. We will pick that up again in a couple weeks. But what we're doing now is just focusing on Christmas time and using some things from the Gospel of Luke and his several chapters that he's written about the coming of Jesus. So that's what we're thinking about. If you were here last week, don't know what happened there. Oh, that happens. Okay, there we go. I have no idea how that happens. It's kind of Christmas magic. I don't know. But if you were with us last week, I started off the sermon by talking about a couple common Christmas films, at least in America. And one of them is this film called It's a Wonderful Life. And I talked some about that story. And then another Christmas film is The Preacher's Wife. And the point of talking about those films is that both of them involved an angel coming, and doing something. In one case, kind of saving a guy's life and giving him a reason to live. In The Preacher's Wife, kind of fixes the preacher's priorities and so forth. But that's, angel stories. And the reason there's Christmas films that figure with angels is because, of course, in the first Christmas story, angels were an important part of that story. They're, showing up all the time, quite unannounced, and having messages for all sorts of people. And so last week we were talking a little bit about what angels say, when they came to Zacharias and to Mary and the shepherds, and their primary message was the gospel. It was the announcement that a king is coming. It was that good news. It was a message of good news that God was intervening in history once again to begin the process of putting everything right, of straightening everything. Of course, part of that message that the angels gave in every case was, don't be afraid. Because, of course, if an angel suddenly appeared behind me, I would probably see it on your face that something was going on back there. I remember years ago, I just thought of this, maybe I shouldn't give this illustration. Years ago, we were doing a beach service, and people were sitting on the beach, and there's a bunch of people sitting there, and I was standing, in the sand speaking, and suddenly I realized no one is paying attention to me. That's because there was some guy behind me who was changing, and so everyone was someone should have said, don't be afraid. Anyway, angels said, don't be afraid. A lot of things are going to change because the king is coming. And it is going to change everything, but it's going to be good. Don't be afraid. So in any case, because of the angels in the original Christmas story, a lot of subsequent Christmas stories have these angels. But of course, you're familiar with many other Christmas stories that get told. One of them that has been made in several different forms is the Grinch Who Stole Christmas. And this kind of evil creature, who doesn't want anyone to be happy, and he tries to ruin everyone's Christmas, and he takes their presents, and blah, blah, blah. It all ends good, and his heart gets big, and he changes, and everyone is happy. Merry Christmas. Another one that I don't even know if is still shown, maybe this is purely American, but Frosty the Snowman, where the hat, I haven't seen this for ages. I think it's a magical hat, and so when he puts the hat on, the snowman comes to life, and so forth. So every Christmas, there's a snowman who comes to life, and I don't remember the story at all. I just know he's dancing around like he is there. So Frosty the Snowman. And when I was a kid, probably one of the ones I liked a little bit better was the story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, who he had a shiny nose. And everyone made fun of him. Not everyone, but all the other reindeer made fun of him until Santa needed the red nose to guide his sleigh. Okay, so these are just other common Christmas stories that, these are all shown, again, in America. Every December, they're on over and over again, and you can watch these multiple times. I imagine they're all on YouTube. So if you're deprived by not ever watching Frosty the Snowman, right now you can go to YouTube, and instead of listening to me, you can listen to Frosty. But of course, the most common Christmas story is this guy, although we don't usually think of him like that, so let's just move on to the Santa Claus story. And I was curious about this picture. I mean, he's looking at the globe, and seriously, he ought to know where he's going by now. Surely Santa Claus, after hundreds of years of, traveling around in his sleigh, does not need to consult his map. Besides the fact, I'm sure he would be up to date, and he would just use his GPS. But in any case, most of you know the Santa Claus stories, and in different countries there's some different versions of it. But again, this is a very common part of Christmas, and outside of the Jesus story, probably the most common picture of Christmas is Santa Claus. Okay? So you know this. This is a Christmas story. And I won't here comment on the existence or non-existence of Santa Claus, because I've several times gotten into trouble, for, publicly saying what I think, that is the truth. And in fact, years when our boys were young, they were evangelizing other boys about the truth of Santa Claus, and so some parents were not necessarily happy with me, but I don't care. But anyway, so in any case, you know that story, and you know some of these other Christmas stories. An interesting image that just came up on someone's Facebook page just yesterday was this: dance like Frosty the Snowman. No, I won't dance like him. Shine like Rudolph. Probably can't manage that. Give like Santa. And love like Jesus. Now, there's nothing wrong with that advice, actually. We would all do better to follow that advice. We'd all do better to dance, actually. Even those of us who can't really dance, it might be nice if I could just be free enough to dance. There's nothing wrong with that advice, but there is a problem. A potential problem with that, and it is that it puts all of those characters kind of in that same category. Frosty and Rudolph and Santa and Jesus. And that's a problem because they're not in the same category. And so what I want to talk about today is what Luke says. And if you saw this on our Facebook page, you might have thought, what's that about? What angels say, you probably could have connected, that theme with Christmas. What Luke says, I imagine even when you're reading the Gospel of Luke, you're not even thinking about Luke. You're just thinking, this is a gospel, or this is the Bible. This is what the Bible says. And it is what the Bible says, but it is also what Luke says. And when Luke was writing his history of Jesus, he was writing things intentionally for a purpose. And he was trying to get people to think a certain way about his words. And so what Luke says is actually very, very important when we think about, anything that's in his writing, but also as we think about the Christmas story. So, this is one of the things Luke said. In chapter 1, verse 5, and we started with this last week, the beginning of the Christmas story was this story about, one of the priests named Zechariah, and he's in the temple, and he's got his little brief stint of burning incense and praying, and that's where the angel comes to him and says, don't be afraid. God has answered your prayer, and he's going to deliver your people, and you're going to have a son who's actually going to be part of that process. But how Luke started that is he said, in the time of Herod, king of Judea. In the time of Herod, king of Judea. At a particular time where a certain man that we know existed, King Herod, was a real person who can be dated in real history. And we know a lot about that guy, King Herod. The Romans loved him. That's why they let him be called king. Okay, because he was the kind of ruler the Romans liked, who kept control. He was also the King Herod who, sent the soldiers to kill all the children, trying to kill the baby Jesus. It's this guy. So he's not such a good character. Luke doesn't mention him because, yay, King Herod is ruling. This is when it happened. It happened at a known time when King Herod ruled. In Luke chapter 3, Luke is going to go on to talk about the ministry of John the Baptist and getting ready for the coming of Jesus. And as Luke turns to that part of the story, the son of Zechariah, this is how Luke introduces that kind of now, 30 years after the Christmas story. This is what's happening, and this is when it happened, quite precisely. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, we know a lot about him, a real person in real history. When Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, we know a lot about him. We know exactly when he was the governor in Judea. From other records, we know exactly when it was. No question, there's no doubt about Pontius Pilate. When Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, that's the son of the previous Herod, King Herod. In the previous story, this is his son, who's not ruling all the same area that King Herod did. Here, Luke calls him the tetrarch of Galilee. His brother Philip, the tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene. We know all about these people. They are in other historical records. We know when and where they were, and this is exactly when and where those guys were. And during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, that's when the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. This is one of the ways that Jesus is different from Frosty and Rudolph and Santa. None of those guys have a date in history. They don't have a time when they existed. There's no other record about their origins. Only Jesus, of all those Christmas stories, only Jesus has a sure date in history. And this is what Luke says. And there's a reason why he's giving us this detail, why he's dating this. Okay, Luke is telling us exactly when it happened. We don't know when Santa existed because there was a St. Nicholas, but he had nothing to do with the Christmas story. And Frosty never was, and Rudolph never was. And there's no date attached to those stories. When was the first time Santa came down the chimney to deliver toys? When did that first happen? There's no record of that. We don't know who is king, president, or anything when that happened. It's got no date in history. Jesus has a date in history. So Luke tells us this for a purpose, and it's related to his purpose for writing this gospel. And so these are the first 4 verses of the Gospel of Luke. So he says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. So Luke is telling us there have been other stories of Jesus that have already been written down. Very possibly the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew have already been written. Maybe some others. Luke is familiar with them. So he says, others have written down this account of what has happened among us, telling these stories that were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke says, I was not an eyewitness. Okay? Luke was not an eyewitness of the life of Jesus, but he said there were eyewitnesses, and they have told the story of what they witnessed in the life of Jesus. They heard and saw John, and they heard and saw Jesus. They experienced those stories, and they passed those stories down, and Luke has heard these stories. And so he says, with this in mind, I myself have carefully investigated from the beginning. So Luke talked to these eyewitnesses. As a very careful historian, Luke is, of all the New Testament writers, he's probably the most scholarly. He's the most educated. His Greek writing style is brilliant. It's artistic. It's literary. He's an extremely well-educated man, probably a doctor, if we can accept the traditions about him. A man of science and a man of literature. And he's carefully investigated everything from the beginning. So he says, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so you can know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So there's this guy, Theophilus, that Luke is writing for first. Theophilus means a lover of God. Some people think that was just not a specific person, but just anyone who loves God, should read this gospel. More than likely, Theophilus was a real person. That title, most excellent, generally applies to officials in the Roman Empire. More than likely, Theophilus had a government position, probably a Roman, thinking about being a Christian, maybe already a Christian, and he's wondering, as an official in the Roman Empire, what's going on and how can I be a follower of Jesus and live in this world of the Roman Empire? Is this really sure? Is it certain? Can I believe this? Is it worth it? Should I risk my career for Jesus if it's not really real? So this is part of the reason Luke seems to be writing this for Theophilus. And he tells us something about his method and his purpose. And reading through the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, you can tell that he is very precise. So, for instance, in that previous passage, he called Herod Tetrarch. Now, if you read the Gospel of Mark about that same Herod, son of King Herod, the Gospel of Mark calls him also King Herod. But that wasn't his official title. The Romans didn't trust him. They trusted his father, King Herod the Great, so that Herod got to be called king. His son, he wasn't trusted as much. And so the Romans didn't recognize him as king. In the Roman system, his title was Tetrarch. He wanted to be king, and people might call him king, so the Gospel of Mark says, King Herod, because that's what people call him. But Luke wants to be precise. And so he says Tetrarch. That's the official title. And that's just kind of a hint about how Luke is writing. This is what Luke says. This is how he thinks, and this is how he writes, and this is why he is communicating, so that anyone can follow his words and can check the records and see, what Luke says here is correct. When he says this guy was governor here, that's correct. And when it was 15th year, that's correct. And Annas and Caiaphas, are those two high priests? No. Caiaphas was the official high priest. Annas was his father-in-law. Annas got pushed over kind of by the Romans, and the Romans made Caiaphas a high priest, but everyone really looked at Annas as a high priest, and so that's why Luke says in the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. Not because there were really two high priests, but it was this bizarre situation that really existed at that time, and Luke knows that, and Luke writes that. And so Jesus has a date when all of this happened, and that's one of the reasons why the Jesus story is different from all those other Christmas stories. So that we can know the certainty of what we have been taught about Jesus, the certainty of that story. We don't have to be certain about any of the other stories. So a lot of those other kind of fantasy stories are, once upon a time. Luke doesn't start his story once upon a time. He says, this is when it happened. It's not a fantasy story, it's a history story. But that tells us, and this is kind of one of my main points this morning, is that if that's true, we really, really need to pay attention to this story a little bit differently than any of the other stories. I'm sure you can find, multiple examples on YouTube of churches that sometime in leading up to Christmas will have all the little kids give the little, Christmas story play, and there's, these little boys wearing bathrobes and towels over their heads, and there's some little doll as a baby Jesus and a stuffed sheep, and there's that Christmas story that the kids put on, and honestly, I think churches just do it for the humor in it. for the YouTube moment. I'm hope maybe they do it because it's good for the kids to practice that and so forth. But what happens after that is we all laugh and clap, and isn't that a nice story? But generally, that little telling of kids in bathrobes, it's like, oh, that was nice. But when Luke writes his story of Jesus, he's not expecting us to just think, oh, well, that was nice. That was a nice story. That was like Rudolph. That's a nice story. It's got a nice message. That's nice. The story of Jesus merits a different kind of response from that. It merits a different kind of attention than just those other sorts of Christmas stories. Now, Luke's dating the Jesus story in history connects with thing that he says in the gospel that he writes, including the facts of the Christmas story. But what I want to do for a few minutes is just to connect the truthfulness of what Luke is trying to do with one of the stories that he tells, and what this tells us about the meaning of Christmas story and whether or not we can believe it. So last week we talked about Zechariah and Elizabeth. And as the story begins in Luke chapter 1, we find out they're an old couple, and they don't have children. They're a very godly couple. They've lived the right kind of life, and yet somehow they've had no children. God should have blessed them with lots of kids because they were really good people. They were righteous in God's sight, but they had no kids, and now they were old, probably didn't have much hope of that, and so there'd be lots of surprises for Zechariah and Elizabeth, when the angel comes, and imagine Zechariah telling his wife, by the way, we're supposed to have a baby. There's her first trimester kind of story, What? Anyway. So they have John, this special birth, maybe even a miraculous or near miraculous birth of John to this couple in their old age. So John is important at the beginning of the story, but John is not the lead character. He's not the main guy. He's got a particular role, and John's particular role is to prepare the way for the main guy, the one the story is about, and that, of course, is Jesus, the Messiah. Okay, and Jesus is, of the whole story, he's it. He's the main guy. And John's role is to prepare the way for him. So John has got an important role to play, but then he disappears because he's just got this temporary role to bring in Jesus, the Messiah. So that's the story that we looked at a little bit last week, and a little bit about the meaning of the story. Now, what's interesting, though, is the pattern of this story. This story has a date in history, and Luke gives us a date. But there's also similar stories that likewise have a date in history. And so, for instance, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, there's a story about Elkanah and Hannah. Characters that even if you're somewhat familiar with the Bible, those names might not come out to you, and you might be thinking, oh, what are those guys about? Are they major characters in the story? Not really. But Elkanah had a couple wives. One of his wives had lots of kids, and that was good for her. She was happy and proud of having lots of kids. Hannah was his other wife. Okay, remember this is back then, the two wives thing. That's not our pattern now. But Elkanah especially loved Hannah. He was his favorite wife. Again, that's part of the problem with multiple wives is then you get into that ridiculousness. But Hannah had no children. And being the wife without the kids was really, really hard. And she's praying at the tabernacle, and the fat high priest, who wasn't such a great guy, sees her lips moving, doesn't hear words, and thinks she's drunk, and rebukes her. And she says, I'm not drunk. I'm pouring out my heart to God, for the baby. And what she was saying is if God would give her a child, that she would dedicate him to the Lord. And so it actually happened. They have a child, and his name was Samuel. And Samuel is a bigger player in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel in the English Bible. The books are actually named after Samuel. Okay, but in fact, Samuel is not the main guy in that story. He had a particular role, and the primary role of Samuel was to be the guy who was going to anoint David the king. Okay, so Samuel prepared the way for David so that when David came on the scene, there'd be kind of a context. Oh, yeah, I guess God is approving of David, and Samuel will anoint David to be the king, and everyone will accept that because they understand Samuel is a prophet. So if Samuel is saying yes to David, then I guess that guy's supposed to be our king. And of course, David is the major player in that story, and he continues to be important because, he's always referenced all through the rest of the Bible. Who is Jesus? Oh, he's the son of David. Okay, so we explain Jesus partially by referencing David, the king. And this has a date in history. I mean, there's really not a lot of questions about David really existing and about when that happened. There's not a lot of reason to doubt this general story. There certainly would have been someone who would anoint David. There would have been prophets at that time. It's totally believable. There was a guy named Samuel, a prophet of the Lord, who anointed David. It's a believable kind of story that can be dated at least somewhat precisely. But the interesting thing about this story is it actually points to another story. It's an older story about Abraham and Sarah. If you're familiar with the Bible, this story at least, you probably know parts of this story. And of course, they were promised a son by God, and then nothing. I mean, year after year and decade after decade, nothing happened. I mean, so much so that in their impatience, they tried to find some way to help God. How stupid is that? But it wasn't until Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 years old when clearly it was past time. The offer of a year's worth of diapers, Abraham and Sarah would not be interested in that offer. We don't have any need of diapers. Well, I mean, maybe sometimes old people, but anyway, that's a whole other story. No, but seriously, that time had passed. They knew that time had passed. There's no baby coming. And so when actually an angel comes and says, oh, it's going to happen, Sarah laughs. But it happened. And so actually they had a son named Isaac. And it's interesting, in the book of Genesis, of course, promised son, but in the flow of the story, there's not a lot said about Isaac. He doesn't actually do a lot. Abraham does a lot. Isaac, not so much. Passive kind of guy. He's there. He's got a couple sons. He doesn't have a lot of control over his sons. His wife kind of has a lot of authority in his household. So that's kind of Isaac. And some people like to make fun of Isaac as a sort of non-entity kind of character. That might not be fair, but in the flow of the story, Isaac is not quite the critical character. The main thing that Isaac does is he produces a son named Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. So this is what Isaac did. He had this role, in a sense, a seemingly small role, to have a son, Jacob. And Jacob did a lot, and a lot of it wasn't so good. But Jacob wrestled with God and held on to God. And he was renamed Israel, and he was the father of the tribes of Israel, the father of Israel. Okay, and that's that story. Once again, something like that must have happened. Exactly when it had, scholars might debate exactly when this happened, but there was an Abraham who was somehow or another the father of the Jewish nation and other nations, actually. He was the father of many peoples. So there's this story, this Christmas story, that's actually part of a pattern. It's the same pattern of this couple who want to have kids but don't have kids, and they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and no doubt wondering, what is God doing? God promised to Abraham and Sarah, and he didn't deliver. What is God doing? And Hannah was loved and didn't have a child. What was God doing? And Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous. And what was God doing? Why didn't he give them a baby? And they're waiting and waiting. But then something happens. And they have this child, and in all three cases, their child isn't the main guy, but he's sent to prepare that. So when people were reading Luke's story and seeing what's going on there, if they knew their Old Testament, they would have thought, this is interesting. In fact, it's more than interesting. This is pretty amazing. Is this something God is doing here? Is this a God story that's come into the middle of history? So my point in all of this is to say that there are reasons to look at the Jesus story differently than the other stories. There are reasons to pay closer attention to what Luke says and Matthew says about the birth of Jesus, to pay closer attention to that story than the other stories. There's nothing wrong with the other stories. I'm not like, Santa Claus is bad and, burn all the Santa Claus. I've got no problem with Santa Claus. It's just a nice Christmas tradition. But Jesus is more than that. And I'm just saying there's reasons to believe that Jesus is more than that. There's reasons to pay close attention to the Jesus story. When the angel came to Zechariah in the temple, he said, don't be afraid. This is what's going to happen. And of course, as we looked at last week, Zechariah asked the angel, how can I be sure of this? I'm old. How can this really happen? This isn't really believable. I didn't expect this. And so the angel said, I'm Gabriel, who's by the side of God, and he's sent from God. I stand in the presence of God, and I've been sent to speak to you, to tell you this good news, the gospel. He used the word gospel, and what the angel announces is the gospel. The gospel doesn't just come. The gospel started with the birth of Jesus because the king came. That's what the angel announced. But now you're going to have to be silent, not be able to speak until it happens. Okay? He's a priest. He should have known better. Okay? He should have had enough faith. So he's going to have to be silent now because he didn't quite believe the words, which will come true at their appointed time. At the right time, it's going to happen. If you were here several weeks ago and we looked at the words, Greek words for time, chronos and kairos, this is kairos, not chronos time, kairos time, the time according to the plan. There's a plan, and in that plan, there's a time for things, and this was going to happen right when it needed to according to God's plan, not Zechariah and Elizabeth's plan. If things happened according to their plan, they would have had a son a lot earlier, and they would have had a normal, routine life outside of Jerusalem, and no one would have heard of them. But they had to wait. They had to wait for God's time. And it surely wasn't easy for them. Okay, but God had a kairos. God had a time according to his plan when things were supposed to happen. And it was going to happen. So what angels say is, number one, Jesus is king. And then don't be afraid. Like we talked about last week, if there's a new king around, things are going to change. Okay, we're not going back to routine. Routine is changing. Okay, it's not going to be the same. It never is the same when there's a new ruler. But don't be afraid, because it's going to be good, because it's the right ruler. It's the king we've longed for. Okay, he's come, and he's starting the process of straightening everything, so don't be afraid. And what Luke says is, you can actually believe that. You can believe it's true. You have reason to believe that is true. It's not a Santa Claus story. It's not a once upon a time story. It's happening at this particular time in history. And you can believe it's true. You can actually believe the angel. You know, this is a time when having a voice from an angel isn't, a time to go see a psychiatrist. It's a time to pay attention. You can believe this story. Now, here's the point for us, and this is kind of the takeaway for us, and that is, as a matter of fact, we all live our lives at this time. It's a time of waiting. We really do live our lives a lot like Zechariah and Elizabeth had to live their lives, and Hannah had to live their lives, and Abraham and Sarah had to live their lives before the child was born. It's this time of waiting. Okay, because Jesus came and he started that process of ruling over the world, but when we look around the world, it does not look like Jesus is king. It doesn't look like that. If everyone was obeying Jesus right now, we wouldn't be listening to the news stories. I mean, think of all the news stories you've heard this last week. We wouldn't be thinking about them or talking about them. Never mention Trump's name again or Putin's name again. It will be gone when Jesus is king. But we're not there yet. We're living in this world, where it doesn't always look like Jesus is king. You walk between this building and to where the train station is, and there's that area behind the train station where a lot of homeless people sit around there, and you can see them talking, and it sure doesn't look like Jesus is king. So it's hard to believe that Jesus is king when we're waiting for him to take control of everything. We need to believe that it's true. It's not the Santa Claus story. Okay, there's reason to believe that Jesus is king, and he is going to come back. And this is the reason why Advent season is very important. I mean, we have 4, we've now lit 4 of the candles, and, on Tuesday, Christmas Eve, we'll light this, but we're still kind of waiting for Christmas. I'll just, there it's on. Okay, anyway, I can project my voice. But it's really a time of waiting. It's a way of teaching kids. Sometimes parents presents put it under a tree weeks before and say, don't touch, until Christmas time. And you're looking at it and kids are, but it's teaching them to wait. Right now, our entire lives is in this Advent season. Okay, we're waiting. We're waiting for the king to come and finally establish complete rule. And it's not easy to wait. It'd be very easy to abandon the story, to wonder what it's about. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? I mean, just back to this picture. When they were waiting, you can imagine how hard it was for Abraham. They all see this. Abraham and Sarah had no idea they were part of this pattern. They didn't see this. They had no idea. All they saw was God wasn't answering their prayer. But now they can see, and just imagine how they can think right now, wow, this is what I got to be a part of. I got to do this. This is why God did it. Thank you for letting me have that role. Sarah can say, thank you for making me barren for 90 years. Thank you. Elizabeth can say, thank you, God, for putting me through that pain, putting me through that shame. Thank you that you did that to me, because now I see what you had in mind. This is God's gift to them, that they got to have this role. And they waited and they waited. It was hard. But they're glad now. And right now we're in this period of waiting, and it's not easy for all of us necessarily. But we need to hold on because the story is true. Its beginning had a date in history. Its ending is going to have a date in history. I don't know when it is. I'm not one of these, it might happen soon. I don't know that. I have no idea when it's going to happen. The world might have to wait another 1,000 years. I don't know. But the beginning had a date in history, and the end is going to have a date in history, and we can believe that. There's reason to believe in that. It takes faith. It's hard to see that when you just look around. We need to hold on to what Luke says, that you can believe it. You can believe this story, this Christmas story. There's a reason to believe it, to pay attention to it, to meditate on it. Think about it and reread it. Tomorrow morning, read Luke chapter 1 and 2 and think about it. Take the story seriously. This is what we can do with this story. Let's take a moment to pray. Maybe you could just think a moment about yourself, and maybe there's something that you're waiting for, something that you're hoping to happen. It might just be a simple thing that you want in your life. It might be a world-changing event. But what is it that you're waiting for? What is it difficult to wait for? What creates tension in your life, maybe even tension with God, about what's going on? So I just encourage us to hold on to what Luke says. And hold on. Father, thank you for the surety that we get in your word. Thank you that there were people like Luke that you used to think and to study and to interview and to write up so carefully and amazingly this story that is different from all other stories. Thank you that you did that. Thank you for faithful people for century after century who have passed the truth down to us so that we have it now. Thank you for that. And I pray that we would hold on to that and that it would give us joy in this season of waiting. Give us joy in waiting, and may that be a light to the people around us. Amen.